What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and we had a huge leak fall in our laps just today. A huge amount of the 10th edition Warhammer 40k rulebook has been leaked online. Big shout out to the community members over from my Discord who ended up getting their hands on this and sending it over to me, because we get to talk about it now, and it answers a ton of questions that we had looking through all these faction reveal articles and these mechanical reveal articles that Games Workshop has been putting out. We now finally get a bunch of answers to things like how charging works, how melee and engagement range work, how a bunch of weapon and defensive keywords that we haven't seen quite yet work, and it's going to be super psyched. So I'm going to go through the whole thing in this video. I'll have timestamps down below if you want to see specific sections, and let's just frickin' dive right in, everybody. All right, a little behind the scenes information for you. I actually got about half of these spoilers halfway through editing the first recording of the video for half of them. So if it sounds like some of the things I say contradict each other, or I talk about mechanics that I don't know the effect of, but then actually I do, it's probably because I didn't have the requisite page at time of recording. Hopefully I will have scrubbed all of those out, but it may not be the case. Anyway, let's dive into this frickin' spoiler, because we have so many leaks to talk about. We'll start things off with the command phase. And the command phase is pretty self-explanatory. Most of the individual portions of it we have seen previously in spoiler articles. The first step is the command step. This gives you your Battleforge CP bonus. You both get 1 CP and then can gain 1 additional CP outside of the command phase each battle round. So that's from things like regenerating CP after targeting units with comms arrays. Importantly, the command step also then talks about that any other effects that occur in the command phase happen now. So this is when you use things like Shadow in the Warp to force Battle Shock on people. After that is done, you then move to the Battle Shock step proper. And the Battle Shock step is exactly, I think, what has been spoiled previously. At the start of the command phase, any previous Battle Shock that your army is suffering is removed. You then do the command phase stuff, and then when you go to take your Battle Shock test, it is for all of your units that are below half strength. So that means that half of their models have been killed, or if they are a single model entity, then they are at half of their starting number of wounds. If you fail, then your objective control characteristic has been reduced to 0, which means you cannot hold objectives and you do not count as contesting objectives. You then, if you fall back, must make a desperate escape test, which we have found out deals damage to them on a 1 or a 2 to each model in the unit, and you cannot use stratagems to affect that unit. The only exception to that is going to be the Insane Bravery stratagem, which sees a return, and we'll talk about towards the end of the video as we talk about the stratagem stuff. We then move on to the movement phase, and this is largely the same, but with some pretty impactful differences. When you are choosing to move in the movement phase before the reinforcement step, you go with each model in your army, or each unit, I should say, in your army individually, and they choose to either make a normal move, advance, or remain stationary. If they remain stationary, they don't move, but they get the bonuses of remaining stationary, like +1 to hit on their heavy weapons. Normal moves move them in movement, a number of inches equal to their movement characteristic, and they cannot move within engagement range of enemy models. There is an important difference to how models move. Just as in 9th edition, when you move a model, you pivot and change its position across the battlefield along any path, but its base cannot be moved across enemy models or across the edge of the battlefield. Flying units are obviously the exception of this. And this is a huge change, and I think one that's enormously impactful to the health of the game. The base of the model cannot be moved over the edge of the battlefield, not any part of the model itself. That was the rule in 9th edition, and it caused so many issues. It meant that protruding wings and pieces of the model that was not actually used for measurement could restrict its movement if it was touching the edge of the battlefield, and that was silly and very ridiculous. Now that's gone. If your wing of your demon pokes over the edge of the table, it's not going to end the world. It's okay. You just can't move your base across it. However, here's the big difference. You can move across friendly models as if they were not there, if you wish. You just cannot end on top of them. The only exception is that monster or vehicle models cannot be moved over other monster or vehicle models. So you can move your models through other monsters or vehicles as long as they themselves are not that unit type. So big parking lots of vehicles will still have their movement restricted a little bit. However, infantry and smaller units can move through other friendlies without a problem, and vehicles can move over other infantry without a problem, which makes moving your army so much cleaner and easier. Other than that, movement is basically gonna be the same. We do have a couple rules around moving around terrain, however. We can see that 2-inch height or less terrain features can be moved over as if they were not there. You ignore the vertical distance when moving over them. Anything else, you must climb up and down. And this is also going to be repeated in the charge phase. These rules are basically the same for charging as they are for moving. Flying, however, has seen a huge change. Flying units now no longer ignore intervening things and ignore vertical distance when moving, but otherwise move across the battlefield. Instead, they move in midair, and they use specifically this terminology through the air right here. Basically, if you are trying to make a flying model move to a higher vertical area where it was, instead of moving it at a straight line and ignoring the vertical distance, you move it at a diagonal. So you then have to literally measure its position to its final placement. It looks like what they recommend you do here is measure from the back of the model to the back of its final position and use that as the actual distance moved. This gets really hairy if your model is moving up or down a building that it can't normally ignore. Whether or not it gets to ignore this lip of the building when moving, because it's actually going to gain a lot of movement moving through that. It seems like that's the intention of the rule, but I'm not sure that's entirely the letter, so it might need a little bit of additional clarification. This rule is super wonky. It's very evocative and very kind of realistic, but it is a little bit strange, I think, when it comes to actually resolving it on the table. You still can't end your movement on people or engage a range of enemies, but you can move over them without penalty, even though ground troops are not normally able to do that. Advanced moves move you your movement plus d6 inches, and you cannot shoot or charge unless you have assault weapons, as we'll talk about in the weapon abilities section. And fallback moves are an entirely new animal. Fallback moves can be used when you're in engagement range of enemy models and move you your movement value in inches. There are some additional special rules here that are hugely impactful. First off, if you are Titanic or can fly, you can just move over enemies while performing a fallback test with no penalty. Any other model that is not Titanic or flies can still do so. So the era of tri-pointing and wrapping units and trying to stop them from falling back and lock them into melee is over. However, any model that does move over an enemy in order to escape when it is making that fallback move takes a desperate escape test. If the unit is battle shocked when it is chosen to fall back, the desperate escape test is then instead checked for every single model in the unit, regardless of whether or not they move over an enemy. A desperate escape test is pretty simple. You roll a d6 for each model that's taking one. On a 1 or a 2, one model from the unit is destroyed. This is kind of like disembarking from a transport in the current edition. When the transport's destroyed, regardless of the model that had to move through enemies, you select any model in the unit to be destroyed as a result of this escape check. So even if your opponent has wrapped a character attached to a unit, for example, you can take the desperate escape check while falling back with that character, and if you roll a 1 or a 2, you can destroy a random mook in the unit. So we're starting off things pretty easily with the shooting phase, and I'm going to just kind of cut to the chase here. The shooting phase is largely the same as it was. Now, one thing that is very sad for me in this leak is that visibility is not discussed at all. So the criteria for selecting a target of a ranged attack is that one model of the target unit for each weapon that you're attacking is visible to the bearer of the weapon and within the range of that weapon. However, exactly what determines visibility is not actually discussed. I imagine that's going to be in a core concept section of the rulebook. We have that in the 9th edition rulebook where they talk about measuring distances and characteristics and basic things like that. Whether or not visibility works the same as 9th edition is a huge question, because if we see the removal of true line of sight and the actual consolidation of visibility into a real mechanic, that would be insanely good, but we just don't know it quite yet. So A lot of things in this document are just going to talk about visibility of models. We don't exactly know what that means. So, generally speaking, all of these ranged attack selection rules are exactly the same in 9th edition. Each one of your models can choose a target independently. Their weapons specifically have to all target the same target, so you can't split one shot from a bolt gun at one target and another at a different target. Making ranged attacks is also the same. And one thing that's not codified in this section of the rules is fast dice rolling. Basically, the attack sequence is going to work exactly the same as it does in 9th edition. You roll to hit with all of the like profiles in a unit targeting a specific target. So, for example, if you have 5 heavy bolters and 4 las cannons targeting an enemy, you're going to pick either your las cannons or your heavy bolters, and you're going to resolve all of those in a sequence all at the same time, rolling the hit roll and then the wound roll. Now, we did have an open question based on some of the rules in the previews that units may not be eligible to be targeted or removed by ranged attacks if they are no longer visible to the attacking unit, and that has turned out to not be the case. Damage will still continue to be carried over even if no members of the target unit are visible. So this is a big blow to things like Necrons and large units that are chaining out to objectives, which we thought for a bit would be immune to attacks if you could kill a couple models in line of sight and the rest of the unit would be safe, but unfortunately that doesn't appear that that's going to be true. Those units are still going to take damage. Now, there's a selection about locked in combat here, describing that units that are in melee cannot shoot, and units, they can't target units that are also within a melee, but monsters and vehicles are the exception, and the big guns never tire rule has been changed significantly. Most importantly, you can fire with monsters and vehicles at units that you're in engagement range with. You suffer -1 to hit with any weapon. It doesn't just have to be a heavy weapon, but otherwise it's basically works the same as Big Guns Never Tire in 9th edition. The other difference here, though, is that the reverse is also true. You can select enemy monsters or vehicles that are within engagement range of units from your army as the target of ranged weapons. However, you get -1 to hit them similarly. Monsters and vehicles can no longer hide in combat. They are gonna be targetable regardless of whether or not they are engaging enemy units. They'll just be slightly safer. In either case, pistol weapons are immune to this hit penalty. If you're firing a pistol, while as a monster or vehicle in melee, hopefully we see the Invictor Tactical Warsuit's pistol heavy bolter back. That is not going to suffer -1 to shoot in melee, unlike all of its other weapons that will. And if you are firing pistol weapons into melee at an enemy vehicle or monster that is engaging other friendly units of yours, that is also not going to be suffering the hit roll. Importantly, there is a designer's note here that clarifies that if you are yourself engaged by an enemy monster or vehicle and you are not yourself a monster or vehicle, then you cannot shoot still. Being a monster or vehicle doesn't automatically make you eligible to be shot. You can just be targeted normally if the unit attacking would normally be able to make ranged attacks. Now, the last thing on this page that we get spoiled here is the stealth mechanic, which is not something that we had seen previously. We kept seeing this get added to datasheets and added to abilities, but we had no idea what it did, and now we do. And it is very simple and much more powerful, I think, than a lot of people expected. You get -1 to be hit from ranged attacks. Full stop. There's no range associated with it. Nothing else. You just -1 to be hit, and that's all. So that's pretty good. Now, datasheets that we've been seeing like Be'lakor make a lot more sense. Not only does that guy make your army harder to target, but even once his Wreathed in Shadow drops, he's still going to be permanently -1 to hit with ranged attacks. So he's not quite as defensively oriented as he was in 9th edition, but he will still have a lot of similar, but he will still have a lot of similar mechanics in that he will retain that hit penalty that he had previously. Now we have some rules about hit rolls and wound rolls, and these have largely not changed. Hit roll and wound roll, you need whatever your weapon skill or ballistic skill is to hit for the hit roll. Hit rolls can never be modified more than +1 or -1, and unmodified hit rolls of 1 always fail. However, unmodified hit rolls of 6 are critical hits and are always successful. Moving on to the wound roll, we see the same chart that we had previously. If your strength is twice the toughness, then you need a 2. If you're just greater than the toughness of your target, then you need a 3. If your strength and toughness are the same, then you need a 4. If your strength is lower than the toughness, then you need a 5. And if your strength sucks really hard compared to the target's toughness, then you need a 6. Easy stuff. And the same things apply. 6s to wound always succeed. They are critical wounds. Wound rolls of 1 always fail, and a wound roll can never be modified more than +1 or -1. The allocate attack step is also an important one, and this is where we would see a rule, if they had it, where units that are out of line of sight cannot suffer damage from attacks. And unfortunately, like we said before, that rule does not, in fact, exist. If a model in a target unit has already lost 1 or more wounds or has had attacks allocated to it in the same phase, subsequent attacks must be allocated to that model. And there is a note down here that it doesn't matter what model is being allocated to, whether or not that model is visible to or within engagement range of the attacking model or units. So in this respect, these rules are basically identical. Now, there are going to be a lot more rules associated with allocating attacks once we start talking about characters and attachment units, because they have their own set of rules, and some things can actually damage characters within a unit independently of the remainder of the unit, in which case they're basically treated as an entirely separate entity, which is pretty interesting. Saving throws are also treated basically identically, with one important exception. A saving throw can never be improved by more than a bonus of +1. So this is taking into account both the armor penetration characteristic of incoming damage and any bonuses such as the benefit of cover that the target model would have against that attack. So for example, if you have some sort of piece of equipment, let's say a storm shield adds +1 to your saving throw, although we don't know if it does that, it may add to your wounds characteristic. If you have a storm shield and you're in cover, the storm shield and cover will not stack against low AP weapons. However, they will if the AP value of the attacker is relatively high. Invulnerable saves are also discussed here. They are saves that are not modified by the AP value of attack and can be chosen to be used over normal saving throws. Now, importantly, there is a call out in the benefit of cover rules that say that invulnerable saves are not modified by the benefit of cover. So while other things may have the potential to modify invulnerable saves positively, cover is not one of them. Next, we move to the inflict damage step, and this is identical to how it was. You loses wounds for each point of damage inflicted by the attack, and if you are reduced to 0 wounds, then excess damage from a single attack does not carry over and is lost. Mortal wounds work in the exact same way as they have previously as well. They are assigned like normal damage, but they're basically individual packets of damage. Now, one thing I want to call out here are these icons on the side of the page. There's a lot of signage within the rulebook that makes it a little bit easier to parse. One thing that we'll notice once we start talking about stratagems is that the stratagems have been color-coded based on their timing. That's also discussed in the actual verbiage of the stratagem itself, but they are color-coded based on whether or not they're on your turn, your opponent's turn, or any time. And each phase that things can take place in are given one of these little icons. It's the little reticule here for shooting phase and the 2 hammers for the fight phase. We also see a pair of chevrons for the charge phase and an arrow pointing upwards as the movement phase. Now, Feel No Pain is the damage ignore roll that we know and love from 9th edition. Every time a wound is lost, you roll a d6, and for each success based on the number of the Feel No Pain, that wound is not lost. Multiple Feel No Pain abilities do not stack, so you don't get to add them together or roll them both at the same time. You'll probably just choose the best one for the situation. Deadly Demise is also listed here as well for a unit that is destroyed. You roll a d6 on a 6. Each unit within 6 inches of the model that is destroyed suffers wounds denoted by the X in Deadly Demise. So we did have an open question about how big the range of the Deadly Demise was, and we had no idea, but it turns out it is a flat 6 inches. And just like in the current edition, if you are a transport, the transport will explode before any models disembark. Now, there is a section on fast dice rolling included in the rulebook as well, which is awesome. I'm gonna skip a lot of the rigmarole here. It's basically identical to the fast dice rolls that were in 9th edition. So if you've played several games of Warhammer 40k, you've probably used these rules, to be honest. You roll all your hit rolls and then all your wound rolls, and then your opponent rolls all their saving throws and allocates damage to models that are eligible to take that damage. If they have models with different saving characteristics, then they have to split them up one at a time. And if you are rolling multi-damage weapons, they do have to roll one at a time, especially for random damage. What's not clarified here, but is kind of implied, is that re-rolling damage rolls, which can still be done with command points, as we'll talk about at the end in the stratagem section, gets a little bit hairy if they're rolling one at a time. That is kind of the weirdness with the 9th edition way it works, and it's sort of implied that you have to slow roll if you want to use it that way, which is how you have to do it in 9th, but it's not actually stated, which is probably going to get a clarification at some point. Now we get to weapon abilities, and these are largely have been spoiled, but there are a couple that we haven't seen quite yet. I will run through all of them very quickly. Assault weapons can be fired even if the unit advanced that turn. However, if you do so, you can only fire with your assault weapons. They don't suffer a penalty anymore for advancing and firing, however, which is a pretty big deal. Rapid-fire weapons get an X number of additional attacks if they are within half range of the weapon's full range. Ignores cover is pretty easy. Your target doesn't get cover, so they don't get +1 to their save for hiding behind terrain. Twin linked allows you to reroll the wound roll. Pistol weapons can be fired even if you are within engagement range of enemy units. If you do so, however, you can only fire with your pistol weapons, and you can only target one enemy unit that is within engagement range of the unit that is currently attacking. Monsters and vehicles are not restricted by the restriction that they can only fire pistols, so they are able to fire pistols and all of their other weapons still in melee. And those pistols, like we talked about in the Big Guns Never Tire rule, will also not receive the -1 penalty for shooting in combat. Just to clarify as well, pistols do retain the restriction that if you fire with a pistol, you can't fire any other types of weapons. They're exclusive to themselves. Unless, of course, you're a monster or vehicle. Turret weapons are the flamers of yesteryear. They are automatically hit with their attacks, and these are going to be ridiculously powerful in 9th edition for reasons that we'll talk about later. If your faction has good flamethrowers, holy crap, you might want to pack those in because these things are going to be absolutely ludicrous. Lethal hits cause critical hits to automatically wound the target, so that is hit rolls of 6 unless you have some sort of ability that improves your critical hit level. Lance abilities, this is a brand new one that we haven't seen quite yet, give you +1 to wound if the bearer made a charge move that turn. So this is specifically going to be weapons like the Virtus Praetors or Eldari Shining Spears have, where they get a bonus when they charge. Pretty self-explanatory. It is a little bit unfortunate because lances used to be the anti-tank weapons of the game, where they would reduce the armor value of any vehicles that they fired at. Now it's just referring to like a big spear. Indirect fire weapons work similarly to how they have been spoiled. They get -1 to hit, and the target receives the benefit of cover if they fire at units that they cannot see. However, they are able to fire at units they cannot see. Just like in 9th edition, however, if any member of the unit can see the target, then the target does not get the benefit of that -1 to hit and the benefit of cover. Melta and heavy weapons we have also seen previously. I'll talk about them quickly before we get into some new mechanics. Melta weapons get additional X damage when targeting units at half range. It's like rapid fire, but for extra damage instead of extra attacks. Heavy weapons give you +1 to hit if you remained stationary that turn, so you chose to remain stationary during the movement phase. Now, let's talk about blast weapons. Blast weapons are called out as making a random number of attacks, but you add 1 to the result of the attacks that you get for every 5 models in the target unit, rounding down. Similarly to the way they work in 9th edition, and also now interacting with the new variety of Big Guns Never Tire, they cannot be made to target units that are in engagement range of any friendlies. So not only can you not fire them at enemy monsters or vehicles that are in melee, but you also can't fire them when you yourself are in melee. So if the target unit being attacked by this weapon is 1 to 4 models, blast will have no effect. At 5, however, it gets +1 attack. At 10 models, it gets +2 attacks. At 15 models, it gets +3 attacks, and so on and so forth until you're getting a billion extra attacks. This means that most blast weapons are going to be D6 +1, or 1 higher than the number of attacks that they would normally be making on the first shot or 2 against most enemy units. Since most enemy units are going to be between 5 and 10 models, blast will affect them at least a little bit. We've been seeing a lot of D6 shot weapons or 2D6 shot weapons be spoiled in these preview articles so far, and those will typically have blast, and that blast does give them a little bit of extra lease on life, especially now that it can affect models of such low model count like just 5 models. Now, the other new mechanic that we have seen is precision, and we had some rumors about what this mechanic could do based on other games like Horus Heresy, but we never really got confirmation. Precision attack successfully wounds an attached unit. That means a unit with a character assigned to it, and the character model is visible to the model with the precision weapon. The controlling player of the attacking unit can choose to have that wound allocated to the character instead. So this doesn't allow you to hit things like unit champions and heavy weapon models within a squad. It can only affect characters, and even then, only if the character is visible. So if the rest of the squad is in front of a piece of terrain, for example, and the character is behind it while remaining in coherency, then the precision weapons will still have no effect. They still have to have line of sight to the character. That said, there are a couple interesting ways to grant precision to your units that are... Okay, Inky, come on. That said, there are a couple tricky ways to grant precision to your units that can make them extremely good at killing enemy characters. On the next page of weapon abilities, we have a couple other ones that are pretty self-explanatory or that we have been spoiled before. The Sustained Hits ability gives you a number of additional hits on critical hits based on the number next to sustained hits. The Extra Attacks ability allows you to make attacks with that weapon in close combat, in addition to your other close combat weapons. So you don't have to choose just one. You can make one normal weapon plus all of your additional attack weapons. The Anti ability gives you critical wounds on whatever Anti says against whatever keyword you are targeting. So it could be Anti-Vehicle on a 4+, which then gives you critical wounds on a 4+, which oftentimes is used in conjunction with Devastating Wounds, which turns the damage characteristic of the attack into mortal wounds on a critical wound roll. So if you have effects like the Anti-keyword, you can be targeting something that you are anti against, roll equal to your anti value, convert your attack into critical, and then that critical attack will convert into damage. We've been talking about this interaction a lot because it's been spoiled a ton on specific units across the game so far. We've been seeing it on things like arc rifles for Adeptus Mechanicus, which have anti-vehicle and devastating wounds. So they have anti-vehicle 4+, so on a 4+, they automatically convert their attack to mortal wounds against vehicles on the roll to wound. Now, the one that we haven't seen quite yet is Hazardous. This is the rule for plasma weapons and a lot of psychic powers that have the potential to wound the attacking unit. Now, these work fundamentally differently than they did in 9th edition. Previously, and in most editions previous to the game, weapons of this type on a hit roll of 1 would either inflict damage or kill the attacking unit. Instead, after attacking, you make a hazardous test for each hazardous weapon that was used within that attack sequence. So you'll count up the number of overcharged plasma guns or overcharged psychic powers that you used that have that hazardous keyword, and you roll up that many d6s. For each one that you rolled, a test is failed and one model in the unit is destroyed, assuming that that model was equipped with a hazardous weapon. If the model that it would be destroyed is a character, monster, or vehicle, it suffers 3 mortal wounds instead. But those mortal wounds must be assigned to a character model if they do so. You can't have a character in a unit of guys with hazardous weapons. The character overcharges their plasma pistol and suffers 3 mortal wounds that they then get assigned to the unit. And this is one of the instances where characters can be damaged separately from units. And characters will actually not be eligible to be assigned saving throws even if they have previously been wounded by things like the hazardous weapon ability until their bodyguard unit is dead or they're being attacked by a precision weapon. Now, the rule is a little bit unclear and it may end up getting an errata, but the hazardous weapon test for each hazardous weapon is a little bit funky. It sounds like you're supposed to roll a d6 for each weapon independently. So let's say you have a character with a plasma pistol, a plasma gun, and a unit champion with a plasma pistol, all overcharging in a unit. That would be 3 separate hazardous weapons, each of which would contribute 1 die to the hazardous weapon test. For each roll of 1, you choose 1 model in that unit to be destroyed or suffer wounds. If it's the character, they suffer 3 wounds, and then the other models would be destroyed. However, it seems like regardless of the specific test that you fail, you can still choose a different model in the unit to be destroyed as long as that model was carrying a hazardous weapon. So in that instance, if you roll 1 dice for each plasma pistol and 1 dice for the plasma gun, even if one of the plasma pistol tests is failed, you can choose the plasma gunner to be destroyed. That's certainly how the example here reads as well. So it seems like characters with a hazardous weapon ability actually kind of want to be assigned to units that also have it, because you can then choose those units, assuming that multiple models with hazardous weapons are rolling the hazardous weapon test, you can choose units that are not those characters to suffer the actual damage from that test. Interestingly, it also just appears to check whether or not the unit is equipped with a hazardous weapon, not fired with a hazardous weapon. So while the weapons that fire hazardous weapons will add to the hazardous test at the end, it looks like you can choose models that didn't even overcharge their hazardous weapons to be destroyed as a result of the other models overheating. It's a little bit funky, but it works in a lot cleaner way than the previous incarnations of this ability, where you would just have models randomly blow themselves up depending on their hit roll. Next up, we get to the charge phase, and this has been hugely overhauled. Charging in 10th edition is going to be vastly different than any variety of charging we've seen previously. Things start off pretty easily. You can charge if you're within 12 inches of one or more enemy units. You did not advance or fall back. You are not an airplane, and you're not already in engagement range. When you charge, you roll 2d6, and that is the maximum number of inches that you can move. If a charge move is possible using the result of your roll, then the unit goes to complete the charge. In order to make a successful charge, you have to be within engagement range of every enemy unit that you selected as part of the charge, other enemy units that you did not select, and you must end in unit coherency. Now, it's not specified in this leak specifically, but it's likely elsewhere in the rulebook, probably in that beginning section where the visibility rules are also being held. Engagement range, based on the diagrams here, looks like it has maintained at 1 inch, so you're still going to be able to engage and attack enemy models within 1 inch of them. If the charge is successful, each model in the charging unit must end its charge move closer to one of the units selected as the target. Fortunately, not towards the closest, so we don't have to do that weird, annoying kind of parabolic movement, but you still have to go closer to your charge target. You can't now use charge bonuses to move backwards to string your unit to objectives or to get other benefits. In addition, if any of these charging models can move base to base with a model in one of the target units, they must do so. However, they still have to satisfy all of the conditions to actually complete the charge. So if the only model that can move base to base would then cause you to fail the charge by doing so, it obviously does not then have to. Importantly, this means that while charges are less flexible, there's also going to be a little bit of intricacy in moving the units in the charge, because one thing that you kind of want to do is actually prevent your own unit from getting in base contact with the target. Pile in and consolidate rules, as we'll talk about momentarily, are still prevented by being base to base by enemies. So the requirement of a charge that it gets you into base contact is actually really bad for you. And what you want to do is prevent your own unit from completing that charge in that way. It's not a great rule, and I'm not really sure why the in base-to-base contact requirement is there, because it actually makes charges much harder to complete in a decent way, but that is what it says. Now, some movement rules are included in here as part of the charge phase. You can move over terrain features that are 2 inches or less in height as if they were not there. However, you must be moved vertically in order to climb any taller terrain features. Flying models also have their own charge rules. They're basically moved through the air to get into engagement range of their charge target, just as we discussed in the movement phase section. So they can move at diagonals if they are moving up to a higher or lower vertical position than they started. Now, moving on to the fight phase, this is largely the same. The steps of the fight phase are basically identical. It looks like we may not see as much of an implementation of fight last effects as we have in the past, because there aren't actually any fight last effects discussed in this fight phase sequence. However, a huge change is that every step of the fight phase starts with the player who is defending, not the player whose turn it is. Currently, the player who is active chooses the first fighter in this first step of the fight phase right here, and then in the subsequent step, the player who is inactive chooses the first combatant. Now, the inactive player chooses both, so both of these are going to be the defending player. This only makes a difference if you have units that fight first naturally, and heroic interventions and stuff like that, like we'll talk about in the stratagem section, do not automatically apply that, so that might be an incredibly rare ability. But if it is available to you, it means that you get to punch charging units first, which makes you incredibly defensively strong. In the fight phase, you then select a unit to fight, pile in, make your attacks, and then consolidate as previously. However, the pile in and consolidate moves have been changed significantly. First off, any model in a fighting unit that is not base to base with an enemy gets to move up to 3 inches. This is your pile in move. Importantly, for a pile in move to be possible, it requires your unit to be able to move within engagement range of enemy unit. Now, importantly, I think this only matters for units that are not already in engagement range. So if you've completed your charge and that's the only unit that's going to be fighting in that situation, your pile in move will automatically be bringing you into engagement range because you're already there. So your pile in move will just progress normally once you get to the fight step. However, if you charge an enemy unit with 2 units, for example, and your first unit to fight kills that enemy unit, the second unit is not then eligible to make a pile in move if it cannot make it into engagement range of enemy models. Each time you make a pile-in move with a model, you must end closer to the closest enemy model. This works exactly like it does in 9th edition, and we're going to see all of the chicanery of using orbital attacks and moving around enemy models in order to get them closer to other enemies, just like we've seen previously. However, if you can move into base-to-base contact with one or more enemy models, you must do so. So if your models are in the front line of the combat, when they pile in, they must get into base-to-base if they can with that pile-in move. That said, again, the controlling player chooses the order in which this happens, so there are going to be some situations where you can move your unit to potentially prevent other models that you want to complete their pile-in move from being able to get to base contact. Now, just as a little bit of an aside, and I don't actually know if this is how it works, but this both works for pile-in, consolidate, and charge moves altogether. Assuming that the movement phase rule that allows you to move through other friendly units is still active during these phases, this is actually going to be kind of difficult to like movement block yourself on, but it does give you a lot of freedom when it comes to moving those models around. If you're able to move to base, and you can do so through other friendlies, it actually kind of gives you a lot of flexibility when you're moving, just with the requirement that everybody's shuffling towards the enemy unit. You then make melee attacks with models that are either, and this is a big change, in engagement range of enemy units, which, as we've talked about, is most likely 1 inch based on the diagrams, or in base-to-base contact with another unit that is in base-to-base contact with an enemy. I haven't been playing 40k for that long, but every subsequent edition I've been watching, the engagement zone that you can attack enemy models in has been getting smaller and smaller and smaller. It started at 1 inch of 1 inch and now has become half an inch of half an inch and has moved into a model base-to-base with a friendly who's base-to-base with an enemy, basically shrinking the entire zone of engagement in combats down to a tiny amount. This is hugely transformative to attacking with units, and especially large units, which I have to imagine are going to struggle to get that many models in engagement range. So if you are excited about getting into melee with your huge swarms of Hormagaunts or Orc boys, you better hope that they have some special rules that allow their pile-in moves to move farther than normal, because if they don't, it's unlikely that many of them are going to be able to actually make their attacks. You then select your weapon to fight with. Each unit can only select one weapon to swing with, but again, we do have that extra attacks characteristic, which can add additional attacks onto the, which can allow you to attack with multiple weapons. You'll then select targets and resolve attacks, just like in 9th edition and in the exact manner that we've discussed normally in the shooting phase. That hasn't really changed. Now, after you finish making all of your melee attacks, you then consolidate, and this has also gotten some huge changes from the previous edition. Just like the pile-in moves, if your unit is not in engagement range of enemies and cannot get within engagement range of enemies, then they cannot consolidate. The exception, however, is if they can unless they can consolidate towards the closest objective marker. Just like pile-in, if neither of these conditions can be met, you do not make your consolidation move, and the unit's fight concludes. Similarly to pile-in moves, if you're not moving towards the closest objective marker by not having any enemy units that you can engage closer to the closest enemy, and you must get into base-to-base contact if you're able to. So overall, we've seen a huge re-emphasis of the fight phase movements, fight phase and charge phase movements into getting into base-to-base contact with your opponent. You need to get to contact with them in order to be able to fight with multiple ranks. You need to be able to get into base contact with any moves that you make in both of these phases, and there are situations where your pile in and consolidate will entirely deactivate if you're not able to pile into subsequent models or units. So this is mostly here, I think, to kind of clean up the phase a little bit. The requirement to get in engagement range, the requirement to get into base-to-base contacts, I really don't like, because I actually think that super complicates the game, but the rest of it does clean things up a little bit. You're not then moving models a bunch of different times if you're just making blank action, making pile in and consolidate moves around the table for a unit that charged, but then is no longer in engagement range. And this is all depicted in these diagrams here. We can see that the Termagant unit is selected to fight, is eligible to fight because it's in base-to-base contact with this Starnguard veteran unit, then makes its pile-in moves and can attack with models that are within engagement range, or models that are close to other friendly models that are base-to-base contact with the enemy. Again, these models in the back here, which could probably have gotten into engagement range to fight in the last edition, based on the half-inch off half-inch rule, are no longer able to fight because they're too far away. They're not in base-to-base contact with the front rank of attackers. This one then depicts a consolidation move, and all of these models move towards the Sternguard veterans, trying to get to base if they can. Now, there are a couple pages in here talking about just data sheets and data sheet abilities. One thing that's interesting is that was pointed out to me is that this is actually the old Rites of Battle ability on this example data sheet here. I assume that this is not actually going to be the case in 10th edition because that is a 9th edition ability, and we know that Rites of Battle itself has an entirely different effect. We also see some abbreviations of the abilities here, and talks about some abilities that we haven't talked about previously. Psychic weapons and abilities are one of them, where if psychic weapons or abilities cause wounds, then they are considered to be inflicted from a psychic attack. This may actually also be the case for hazardous abilities of psychic attacks that the unit has themselves, although I'm not 100% sure, and that may need to be clarified. Aura abilities is also defined, and it is noted here that units will benefit from their own aura abilities, which is huge, because a lot of the aura abilities in the game are no longer keyword locked, so they will affect characters who have them themselves, and they are extremely powerful for those characters to have. And leadership checks are also described here as a 2d6 roll, trying to get equal than or greater than the leadership characteristic in the target unit. Now we have some deployment abilities, and these ones are huge. We see, first off, the return of infiltrators, an ability that during deployment allows you to set up more than 9 inches away from enemy deployment zones and enemy models, is still in existence. I thought for a hot minute that these would get entirely reworked into the scout ability, as we saw on the Genestealer datasheet, but it seems that that is not the case. And Genestealers, unfortunately, just got a big old nerf. So the scout ability is interesting. It gives you an X-inch movement before the game begins. That movement, similarly to infiltrators, cannot move within 9 inches of enemy models, but interestingly is not restricted from being near the enemy deployment zone. The other benefit is that if the unit embarks in a dedicated transport, the dedicated transport is then conferred the scout ability. And this is how a lot of these abilities worked in the past, but it's nice to see it clarified in this rule. We didn't see it on 100% of them, and so we may see some new units be able to influence transports with their pregame moves. Deep Strike is another one that we basically knew the ability of, but this one might have a ridiculously transformative change. Importantly, you declare it during the start of the game, at the start of the battle formation step, and you can set the unit up in reserves instead of on the battlefield. Then, in the reinforcement step of any of your movement phases, you can set it up on the battlefield more than 9 inches away from enemy models. The important clarification here is that it's not your movement phases beyond the first. So, according to this, deep striking is able to come in on the first turn. Now, the caveat is that that's also how it works in 9th edition, and the GT packet restricts deep strike from being able to come in on the first battle round outside of units like the drop pod with their drop pod assault. The thing that throws a little bit of a wrench in the works here is that there are some other reserve abilities that are described in the core rulebook that we've seen leaked that themselves restrict those reserves from coming in on the first battle round. And we're not entirely sure the contents of the new GT packet. It's likely going to have some formulations for the new mission card set, but I don't know how many actual mission abilities it will include. So I think there's a pretty reasonable chance that deep strikers are going to be able to come in on the first battle round full stop, which is going to be super powerful if that ends up being the case. Certainly save some ink on those drop pod assault rules. You don't have to clarify drop pod assault if every deep striker works like a drop pod, so that's something, I guess. Now, the leader ability is one that we basically already know the broad strokes of. If your characters have the leader ability, then they can be entered into units during the declare battle formation step of the game, so that's like the reserves and transport step, essentially. When they attach to a unit, they are considered to be attached. The unit is said to be an attached unit and becomes a bodyguard unit. As long as a unit is a bodyguard for a character, the toughness of the unit itself is used full stop for any incoming attacks. The character's toughness is not used at all. However, even if the character has lost wounds from things like the hazardous ability or enemy precision weapons, attacks cannot be allocated to it unless those attacks or wounds have a separate ability, like precision or hazardous, like we talked about previously. The character is totally ineligible to be assigned saving throws until the bodyguard unit is dead. And this is the situation where characters basically operate as their own entity within a unit, where even if the character is suffering damage from overcharging their own weapons or being shot by sniper rifles, they are still have their own separate wounds pool that basically won't interact with the wounds pool of the bodyguard unit. And even if the character has a very strong defensive profile, they can't be assigned the attacks that the bodyguard unit are meant to take. Even if they would be able to tank a bunch of anti-infantry shooting, for example, those anti-infantry shots are still going to go into the infantry around them. Now, before we move on to the last section discussing stratagems, we will talk about strategic reserves real quickly. Now, strategic reserves are where we see the restriction on reinforcements coming into the table on any movements phase except for the first. And this is why I think that there's a reasonable chance deep strikes are not going to be restricted from coming in on the first battle round. The restriction on strategic reserves is now dependent on game size. It's not just a proportion of your points. On a strike force game size, you can put up to 500 points into strategic reserves. On an incursion game size, you get 250, and onslaught, you get 750. So essentially somewhere around 25% of your army total, which is the limit of your strategic reserve total. You can't put fortifications in strategic reserve for obvious reasons, because they're a big building and they're not very sneaky. They're not good at outflanking people. And when those strategic reserves come in off the table edge, they have a little bit of a simplified version of the 9th edition variety. They can come in outside 6 inches of any battlefield edge, including your opponent's battlefield edge, on the second round onward, but they cannot be set up within the enemy deployment zone. However, that restriction drops off in the third battle round. So battle round 3, they can be set up within 6 inches of any battlefield edge, and in any case, outside 9 inches of enemy models. So importantly, we do have the removal of the ability for reinforcements to set up in engagement range of enemy units if they are close enough to their own battlefield edge, which, to be honest, was a very confusing and convoluted ability that was rarely used, so I'm not really too sad to see that one go. The removal of the restriction of deploying off of your opponent's battlefield edge, though, is a really big deal, and will open up the potential placement for strategic reserves in a really big way. Now, one thing that we don't know is whether or not aircraft are going to be forced to enter strategic reserve. It may be that aircraft have their own sets of rules, but they have not been spoiled in this set of pages. Okay, last but certainly not least for this video, let's talk about some frickin' stratagems, everybody. The first thing I want to talk about are the basic restrictions. They're basically the same as that you had previously. You can only use the same stratagem once per phase, but you can use them multiple times per battle. You must have the CP to pay for them. You can't spend trying to gain CP back if you don't have any CP, for example. And all of the stratagems, like I mentioned at the top of the video, have been color-coded. If they are green, you can use them at any time. Green is good to go. If they are blue, you can only use it during your turn, the blue turn, I guess. If they're red for enemy, you can only use them during the opponent's turn. And here we go. We start off with some green ones that you can use at any time. The first one being command reroll, which gets this little check mark, which means it's useful in a bunch of different situations. You can use it after you have made a hit roll, wound roll, damage roll, saving throw, advance roll, charge roll, desperate escape test, or importantly, hazardous test. So that is rolling to see whether or not you take casualties or damage from overcharging a hazardous weapon, and you re-roll that test or saving throw. Importantly, we do not see leadership checks in here, but there is a return of Insane Bravery, and in fact, an extremely powerful version of Insane Bravery that has been added into this selection of stratagems that you can use when you are taking battle shock tests. The counter-offensive stratagem is used after an enemy unit fights. You can then choose one unit from your army that is in engagement range, and that unit fights next for 2 CP, exactly as we see it in 9th edition. Now, the exciting one, and I did say that there would be ways to give precision to your units, is...
I challenge you to a duel.
And this makes combat characters an absolute nightmare to deal with in this new edition if you have your own characters, because for 1 CP, when that character unit is chosen to fight and is in engagement range of an enemy attached unit, so that is specifically a unit that has a character included within it, your character can gain the precision ability until the end of the fight phase, meaning that you choose when you make your melee attacks whether or not those melee attacks will be assigned to an enemy character within the targeted unit. Now, the reason that this is so insanely powerful is that the precision attack weapon ability comes into play every time a wound roll is successful. And given the way that the attack sequence works in Warhammer 40k and has worked in the past and still works, continues to work in this edition, is that you then continue the attack sequence every time one of those wound rolls is made. So, for example, if you have a character with 8 attacks and they attack into an enemy unit that has an attached character and you give it the precision keyword, and let's say you wound with 6 of those, you can then tell your opponent every time you successfully wound one of those that that attack is going into the character until the character is dead. So if it takes 3 attacks to kill the character, the remainder of your attacks can then target the unit anyway. So you don't lose any efficiency for having the precision keyword on your own character. You will just, if you have the attacks to overkill their character, kill their most valuable and probably most combat effective model in their unit before then carrying over damage to the rest of their unit. So if we see characters, especially characters that can get drawn into combats like Abaddon or like the Swarm Lord that have wildly powerful melee attacks, they are going to be able to start swinging into enemy units that are led by things like Space Marine captains and kill the Space Marine captain and then a bunch of models from the unit as well, which is wildly powerful. This stratagem is insane. The Insane Bravery stratagem sees a return. It now is able to be used after a battle shock test is failed for a unit in your army. However, importantly, it is only during the battle shock step of your command phase, meaning that you cannot use it on out of phase battle shock tests like Shadow in the Warp or the battle shock tests caused by Infernus squadrons. When you use it for 1 CP, not 2, and it is repeatable, you can do it multiple times per game, the battle shock test is instead passed. With the importance that battle shock has in the game and has the potential to lose you objectives if your units randomly take damage and are battle shocked, having this stratagem as powerful as it is, I think is going to be a really important thing. Now, the grenade stratagem is also one that we kept seeing referenced, especially with the grenade keyword on a ton of models that have been spoiled, but we had no idea what it does, and it is in fact extremely strong. Now, the timing is a little bit weird. You use it in your shooting phase before a grenade unit in your army that is outside of engagement range of enemies and within 8 inches and visible to an enemy unit has been selected to shoot. So importantly, that doesn't mean that it happens when the unit is selected to shoot. It just must be used before that unit shoots. So the timing is a little bit awkward. You have to hold that unit until later in your phase in order to use the grenade stratagem later on if you want to. However, you cannot then use the grenade stratagem after that unit has fired. But you can use the grenade stratagem and then go and fire with a bunch of other units and then go back to the unit that threw the grenade. Very strange timing. When you use the grenade stratagem, you target one enemy within 8 inches and visible to the unit with the grenade. You roll 6 dice, and on a 4+, the enemy suffers 1 mortal wound for an average of 3 mortals. I think the most important use case for this is when you have fired a bunch of guns at an enemy that's in your lines, and you haven't quite killed them or haven't quite brought them down to a bracketed level or a damaged level, as the term is in 9th edition. You can then, for 1 CP, use the grenade stratagem as a last resort and ping them for a couple of additional damage, which seems totally fine. The attack shock effect also returns in this edition with a similar ability to the grenade stratagem. This is used in your charge phase after a vehicle unit from your army ends a charge move. It can then do mortal wounds to something in engagement range, effectively kind of an impact attack. You choose one melee weapon that it has, and a lot of these vehicles are strength 6 or strength 8 melee weapons, and you roll the strength characteristic of the attack in d6s, adding to if your strength characteristic is greater than the enemy's toughness. For each 5+ you get, the target suffers 1 mortal wound, meaning that a lot of vehicles are going to be able to roll 8 to 10 dice, targeting smaller enemy units, and doing 3 to 4 mortal wounds for 1 CP on this tank shock. But it does require your tank to get up into melee, and that does potentially mean it is going to be in danger. Especially given the fact that tank can be fired at while in melee as well, this doesn't necessarily mean that your opponent has to fall back in order to fire at your tank. So there may be situations where this actually isn't that great for you. Rapid Ingress, we saw previewed in the Terminator article. You use this at the end of your opponent's movement phase. You bring 1 unit in from reserve, and that can arrive on the battlefield as if it were the reinforcement step of your first movement phase. As if it were the reinforcement step of your own movement phase. Importantly, you cannot use the stratagem to bring a unit in on a battle round. It would not normally be able to do so. So while you can bring things in on your opponent's turn out of strategic reserve, you cannot do so on the first battle round. But unless there are other rules that we're not seeing, you can do that on deep striking units, allowing you to bring in deep strikers at the end of the first movement phase of the game. This potentially gives things like Space Marine Terminators or other deep striking units the potential to really alpha strike your opponent, waiting until you've seen where they move and then deep striking yourself in a relatively safe position that you can then move and charge into their army with. And this is all on the first turn of the game, so you'd better hope that you have scout or forward deploy units that can prevent enemies from turn 1 deep striking you, because it could potentially be disgusting. The Fire Overwatch stratagem is a huge difference, and we did hear a couple inklings of this from Warhammer Fest, but now seeing it in action, this stratagem is going to be absolutely ludicrous. You use it in your opponent's movement or charge phase after an enemy unit is set up, or when an enemy unit begins or ends a normal move, advance, fallback, or charge. So you can use it essentially to auspex scan enemy units coming out of reserve, or you can use it to shoot enemy units that begin or end a move. So whether they're trying to move out of line of sight of you or they're moving into line of sight of you, those are all going to be eligible to be overwatched. You do need to be within 24 inches, and you do need to be eligible to shoot as if it were your shooting phase. You then shoot at the target, but just like in the previous edition, you only hit on hit rolls of 6. You ignore all of your attacking weapons' ballistic skill and its modifiers, so you don't get +1 to hit, for example. However, it's likely that torrent weapons will still automatically hit, which is why I said earlier that torrent weapons were going to be absolutely ludicrously powerful in this edition. There are situations where you can use this as kind of a double tap. You can run your unit with a torrent weapon up to your opponent's army, shoot them in your shooting phase, wait until their movement phase, and if they elect to move away from you or towards you, either way, they can be shot again thanks to Fire Overwatch. This is potentially so much damage from these auto-hitting flame weapons, it's ludicrous. Importantly, you can only use the stratagem once per turn, so you can't double it up in both the movement and charge phases. However, in order to be eligible to Fire Overwatch, you don't have to be the target of a charge in the charge phase. You just do it when your opponent goes to make a charge move. Importantly, I think that means if the charge fails, you are not then subject to the Fire Overwatch stratagem because you haven't started the charge move in that case. But it does mean that you can have a unit that is standing by and not in easy charge range that you're not even going to elect to declare as the charge target who can still shoot at you during your opponent's turn. You can also fire at people after they end a charge move, which is really only relevant if they are a vehicle and charging into range, which is kind of cute, I guess. The counterplay to this ability is actually standing still.
Keep absolutely still. This vision's based on movement.
It does not trigger if you remain stationary, only if you perform a move. So if your opponent is representing the fact that they want to double tap with this Fire Overwatch ability, you can just elect to stand there and stare at them. And they unfortunately will be totally powerless to stop you. The Go to Ground stratagem has returned. This used to be an ability you could use in 4th edition to give yourself cover in exchange for pinning yourself, which was a kind of cool reactive effect. Now for 1 CP, when your infantry is targeted as the target of an enemy ranged attack, you can give it the benefit of cover and a 6+ invulnerable save. Especially for medium weight infantry where the benefits of cover give them a huge defensive benefit, this is going to be huge, and the 6+ invulnerable save is a nice bonus as well against high AP shooting. Especially since that affects them until the end of the phase, so you could use the benefits of cover against low AP weapons, and then even if your opponent fires big handful anti-tank weapons into you to get around that cover, you're still going to have a 6+ invulnerable save, which is pretty sweet. We see a similar effect on Smokescreen as well. This is for smoke things, which are typically vehicles with the smoke keyword and smoke launchers. Previously, it has given them -1 to be hit, which is now represented by the stealth ability, giving them -1 to be hit, pretty self-explanatory, but they also gain the benefits of cover. So a lot of these smoke keyworded vehicles are going to be incredibly tanky with enormous saving characteristics. Heroic Intervention is importantly also now a stratagem, not an ability that characters can use. Now, this kind of works like how everyone assumed Heroic Intervention did in the past. It responds only after your opponent ends a charge move within 6 inches of your unit. If they do, you can then use the stratagem to declare a charge back on them. You then resolve that charge as if it was your own charge phase, however, you do not receive the charge bonus, so you do not get the automatic strikes first. Your opponent will still be able to hit you first, and will probably be in a pretty decent spot to hit you pretty well, since they're then immediately going to pile in. However, it does give you the ability to muck with your opponent's pile-ins, potentially saving some damage on the unit they initially charged. Now, there is a restriction on this. You can only select a vehicle unit to intervene if it is a walker, so basically dreadnoughts and sentinels and things like that. However, unlike Tank Shock, which is only eligible for vehicles and not monsters, any monster can perform a heroic intervention. And with that, that is the entirety of the rules that we've had spoiled for the 10th edition rulebook so far. Holy crap, was this a doozy. What an absolute dump of information. One thing that has been hugely transformed, obviously these stratagems are enormous and the character rules are huge to know, but also the charge and fight phase interactions are way different now. Basically, they've changed where the emphasis lies in combat phase movements rather than entirely removing the interaction wholesale. Although, in a lot of situations, they are going to be a lot more restrictive than they were. You're no longer going to be able to charge in a billion different directions just by making a successful charge against a single enemy unit. Super duper big deal. Let me know down in the comment section what you think, and big thanks for watching all the way to the end of this super long video. Thanks so much, I really appreciate it. I'm editing this at, we are 2 a.m. right now, so that's great. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. Remember to keep it classy, folks. Have happy wargaming, and big thanks to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.